Good afternoon, everybody. Buenas tardes. Thanks all for coming to the Inter-American Dialogue. It's great to see a lot of good friends here. For the dialogue, this is a very special event, and it is for me personally. Maria Arana has been a good friend for many years. She's a prominent, widely respected Peruvian-American author of nonfiction and fiction. We share a passion for Peru, where I lived for 4 years in the late 1980s and early 1990s. I regularly hand out to friends copies of her two of her previous books, American Chica, her memoir, and her outstanding and widely reviewed biography of Simón Bolívar. I tell them, you must read this, you have to read this. Today, we will celebrate and discuss her most recent and perhaps most sweeping and ambitious book, Silver Sword and Stone, Three Crucibles in the Latin American Story. The book illuminates three enduring themes that have defined Latin America since pre-Columbian times: the foreign greed for mineral riches, an ingrained propensity to violence, and the abiding power of religion. These themes are germane to the wild, dramatic, and surprising turn of events in Latin America these days. To interpret what is happening in a region that seems on fire, we need a brilliant storyteller like Marie. Reflecting on what's going on today in Latin America, a Venezuelan friend recently said to me, Garcia Marquez was a great writer, but lacked imagination. When Marie is not writing terrific books, she serves as senior advisor to the U.S. Librarian of Congress, the director of the National Book Festival, the John W. Klug Center's chair of the Cultures of the South, and a writer at large for the Washington Post. For many years, she was the editor of the Washington Post Book World. So welcome, Marie. We're also thrilled that Tom Gelton is here to conduct conversation with Marie and to moderate the discussion with all of you. Tom is also a very good friend and a friend of the dialogues for many years. Just over a decade ago, we were honored to hold a special event and discussion on his remarkable book, Bacardi and the Long Fight for Cuba, the biography of a cause, which earned him many awards and prizes. You may not have seen Tom before, but you've certainly heard him. He's a familiar voice on NPR, where he worked since 1982. I won't mention all of his assignments. I hope that's okay, Tom. But just note that he was NPR's pioneer foreign correspondent, first posted in Latin America. He currently reports on religion, faith, and belief for NPR. His latest book is A Nation of Nations, a great American immigration story, and it's a great book. So thank you very much, Tom. Following this conversation, we're very happy to host a wine and cheese reception. Sorry, no ceviche today, Marie, but we hope you enjoy that. We'll have Marie's book on sale just here outside, and she'd be willing to sign copies if you like. I highly commend the book to you. Before turning it over to Tom, I just want to give special thanks to my colleague, Irene Stefania, for her terrific work in coordinating and managing this event. Thank you all very much. I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. So let me say at the outset what a privilege it is for me to lead this conversation with you, Marie. Those of you who know, some of you may know that I reviewed Marie's book for the Washington Post, and anyone that read it knows that I think it's a marvelous book. You pulled off this achievement, Marie, of writing kind of what I see as the internal history of Latin America, really the story of Latin America's soul over the last 500 years. It combines literature, journalism, and history all in one. It's just a powerful and epic story. And in my review, I noted how you said at the outset that you find a commonality, a concrete character, if you will, that emerges from the Spanish-American experience. To write a book that summarizes and expresses that commonality is quite an achievement, and I think you did it really beautifully. So let's start with the kind of that meta question. The The one that sort of stuck out for me right from the beginning is the contrast between the North American post-colonial story. North America, of course, is now the, richest, most powerful region on earth versus South America. Here we have two sides of the Western Hemisphere, the northern half and the southern half, that have had such different post-colonial experiences. What is the explanation? It's the big question. What is the explanation for this incredible difference between the northern half and the southern half?
Thank you, Tom. First of all, can you hear me? First of all, I want to thank you for this, not only for the review, which was a wonderful review, such a sympathetic but understanding review, which an author can only hope for. And I want to thank Michael, too, for this extraordinary institution that he runs, which I admire so much and has done so much for inter-American relations. So it's a pleasure to be here. The difference between North America and South America and Latin America, this was the whole impetus behind this book. I had just published a biography of Simón Bolívar, and I was struck really by the differences in the wars of independence and how stark those differences were, just in terms of prosecuting a war over a certain kind of terrain. You had, in North America, you had the war being fought over the rolling hills of Maryland and Virginia. And you had a very different context with the British soldiers and the rebel soldiers. Very different indeed, very different leadership. And in Latin America, of course, where the wars of independence were fought over terrain that was unforgiving, over the Andes, and very often, San Martin and Bolivar both went, worrying over this colossal mountain range, and then in the jungle, and then in the rivers, and in a very difficult terrain. And it was, the area was 7 times as large as the area that the North American Revolution was fought in. So there was that, and I was having a conversation with my aunt, who was probably the most brilliant woman I've ever known. She was self-educated, spoke 7 languages, including 2 indigenous languages. She taught herself completely. And she'd always been my mentor and my inspiration. And we were having this conversation. I was saying, I think there's something to the fact that the wars of independence were so different. And I think that it tells us, because I firmly believe that history does inform the character of a people and the culture. And so we were talking about the differences, and I was telling her about this, and she said, well, do you really, in your heart of heart, thinks that the personality of the people is that different? And I said, I do. And she said, well, if you really do believe that, she said, I challenge you to write a book about it and get it down. And there it was a challenge. So I, was obligated, because she's my godmother and my aunt and my sort of nudger and pusher, that I needed to do this. And so then, of course, I scratched my head and pulled my hair and thought, how do I tackle this? And the only way I felt I could tackle it was by actually fusing a historical book with a book of journalism. That actually the report, if I'm trying to say, history informs the people, then I have to describe the people and describe the history too. So I took on this range of 1,000 years and tried to make it as much of a narrative and an arc as I possibly could. When I actually sat to think, what are the commonalities and what are there's, very often when we come as immigrants to this country, I came to this country when I was 9 years old, and I came virtually as an immigrant, although my father is Peruvian, my mother is North American. You come and you are made to identify yourself as a Hispanic. Well, what does that mean? For a Latin American, you're Peruvian, you're Colombian, you're Venezuelan, you're Costa Rican, but you're not a Hispanic. You don't think of yourself as a Hispanic. And in fact, that act of identify, because eventually you do. You think, okay, I have, friends who are Chilean, friends who are Venezuelan, friends who are Colombian, and one after another, we find the commonality. And so I started with that. What is that commonality? I remembered a story that my grandmother told me. It wasn't a story. It was just, this is the way we are. In every family, she said, every family that wants to make something of itself, of our people, we have many sons. And of those many sons, one is urged to be in the financial world, in the commercial world, in the world of trading money, trading power. Another son is encouraged to be a warrior and become a soldier and a general, perhaps, or an admiral, and actually protect the native land. And the third son is meant to go out and be a priest, to save our souls and teach the world the better parts of ourselves. And this was just something that she said all the time. And she was saying, so I have the
three Cruz.
The first one who was my father, and then I have the second one who is the soldier who was my uncle, and I never got the priest, and she was very disturbed by that. And I thought, well, this is a peculiar thing of my grandmother's, and I never read it in a history book. But eventually, I began listening to people. It's a common thing. I mean, it was common among Latin Americans to think that this would be a good way to sort of establish a power structure. And indeed, when I thought about it, these were the pillars of the way a power works. I mean, you engage power, you keep power by commanding exactly the gold, or in my case, the silver. Silver was far more plentiful in Latin America than gold. And the sword, which is the military man, the warrior, and the stone, which was the priest. And if you know about stone in Latin America, stone, of course, was worshipped by the indigenous. It was the absolute concrete expression of what we call in Peru Pachamama, which is the earth mother. And so stone was sacred, and you respected stone, and you worshiped stone, and you built your monuments of stone and your religious objects of stone. And when, of course, the conquerors came, they slapped their stone on top of the indigenous stone. In fact, they took apart the indigenous temples, knowing that those places would be considered sacred and powerful, and so they put their cathedrals on top of the indigenous temples. You see this in Mexico City. If you go now, they are doing an extraordinary excavation in the middle of Mexico City, which was Tenochtitlan, and under the city, right under the square in front of the cathedral, are the stairs of the Adoratorium of Montezuma. So literally, stone was slapped on stone in the same way that it was in Cusco when they built the big cathedral in Cusco right on top of. In fact, you can see the foundations, and they left the foundations to make the point that our stone is superior to your stone. So those three things seem to me to have a common voice in all of Latin America.
So your book covers 500 years, but it seems to me that you really have the deepest interest in the original encounter. To me, that's what really came out. What was it about that encounter that was so momentous?
So defining. It was so extraordinarily defining in so many ways. And it was momentous in other ways, too, in the ways that the two parties came together, because in the indigenous world, in the three most important empires of the indigenous world at the time, which were the Inca Empire and the Aztecs, of course, the Muisca in Colombia. And they were all of these empires, which were extraordinary. Really, they understood astronomy, they understood the agronomy, they understood economies of trade. They understood how to control culturally and how to actually manage the ethics and the education of their masses when they needed where they needed their masses to be. They were dramatically hierarchical. They were also, I think, a lot of historians don't really face this as directly as they should. They were also a very violent culture, and they weren't at all pacific and then conquered by these rabid Spanish. They were quite warlike, and were conquerors themselves. And the Spanish at the same time had just gone through the wars with the Moors, and they had ejected the Moors at the time. It was a 700 or more year occupation by the Moors in Spain, and the Caliphate had ruled, and it had been very stubbornly ruled, that whole area of Spain and then North Africa all the way to the Middle East. And the king and the queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, had been, Ferdinand especially, fighting this enormously savage war at the time. And so Spain was depleted. What did it have at that point? It was bankrupt. It had spent all its money to massacre, really, and eject the Moors, and to eject the Jews at the same time. And it was bankrupt. It was actually quite beside itself to support Spain and to grow Spain after this conquest of land that it had achieved. And at the same time, the Pope divided the world so that Portugal got the north coast of Africa, which Spain had been actually exploiting. It had conducted a very, very vibrant slave trade in Spain. Columbus and all of the explorers who actually went to the Americas actually had done slaving on the north coast of Africa. And so the Pope drew the line and said, okay, this is for the Portuguese and this is for Spain. And what was for Spain were these dried up little Canary Islands and then beyond. And of course, they went beyond. And so here what you had were the Spanish soldiers who had been honed by generations and generations of fighting the Moors, the Crusades. And they were violent to the first degree. So you had these two enormously violent cultures facing each other. And both of them are in trouble. You know, the Spanish need the gold. That's why they went. It was, you know, the whole business of evangelizing was an excuse and a sort of cover for what was actually at play, which was precious metals, gold. We need to bullion to actually fuel the economy and grow Spain. And at the same time, what was happening in the indigenous cultures is they had conquered so many tribes that the tribes were restless. There were those who they had made great enemies in the yet to be conquered world, and in the Inca Empire, one brother was fighting another for the ascendancy to the throne of the Inca Empire. Atahualpa and Huáscar were fighting each other. And of course, in the Aztec world, Montezuma had just said, you know what, we have to really straighten up this empire because there's too much liberty afoot. And so we have to tighten up and make the family of the Aztecs more powerful than it has been. He stripped the warriors, who at that point were generals and famous and powerful. He stripped them of their power and said, no, you can't have so much power. It's the emperor's family who retains that power. And he literally made them wear tunics and shave their heads. Well, there was great anger afoot in the Aztec culture. And the same, the Muisca were having trouble with their conquered tribes as well. So you had these three areas that were very uncertain at that moment in time. And who comes in but Spain, which is very uncertain about its status and needs the money. So it was that conquest to me, that coming together, that forceful and fateful meeting of two cultures not understanding each other, wanting to conquer each other for very different reasons, and the great sort of misunderstanding. You know, everybody says, "Oh, 140." Pizarro came with 140 people, and they conquered the whole empire. Well, that isn't the case, of course. What they did was they engaged the enemy tribes, and in force they conquered the Inca. So that moment to me says so much.
Right. Well, let me just interject here that you've got some incredible characters in that moment. We got, you mentioned Atahualpa, you got Huayna Capac, you got Pizarro, you got Montezuma, and I think your skills as a novelist really enable you to. These are incredible characters, and you really do bring them to life. That's one of the great strengths of the story. But going back to the difference between North America and South America, one big difference, and you've just alluded to it, is there were no empires in North America. I mean, the native population in North America were largely hunting and gathering cultures, and I think you make the point that that's one of the differences that really did make was consequential.
Absolutely. Well, as we all know, the first thing that the Spanish conquerors did was combine with the population. They had to. They didn't bring women at first, and so the mestizo race was born. In the North American case, the Indians were seen as landscape. You know,
Yeah.
something to push back. The intermarriage was almost nil.
Right.
Certainly, nobody was conjugating with the Indians. If you were a pioneer, you were bringing your women, you were bringing your children, you were bringing everything. You didn't combine in the same way, or as happened in Latin America. Immediately there was a mestizo culture, and then Spain was very, very deliberate about creating a hierarchy. I mean, when you go, as I've gone to these old cathedrals in, say, Ayacucho, or you know, in the mountains of the Andes, and even in those, the Spaniards were so organized in some respects and so disorganized in others, but they kept logs of everybody who was born, and everybody who was born was registered by race or by sort of level of race even, so that, and it wasn't like, you know, was your father or your mother an Indian? It was, no, it was, how do you look to me? And then, you know, it would be written down, and that racial identification would follow you for your life and define who you were.
Amazing. So in reviewing Marie's book, which we all do as reviewers, we oversimplify sort of your message and maybe even exaggerate a point that I read in your book, which was sort of the contrast between the indigenous civilization and the brutality of the conquerors. And I was criticized in reviewing Marie's book for sort of idealizing and perhaps even exaggerating the achievements of the indigenous civilization. It was pointed out to me that, you know, these great empires actually hadn't been able to invent the wheel, which you acknowledged, and also that they, as you also acknowledge, were capable of tremendous violence. But I need you, I guess, to sort of defend that criticism or deal with that criticism a bit as well. Is there a temptation sort of in telling this big story to kind of idealize the indigenous civilization and excessively sort of brutalize the conquering population? Does that obscure sort of the more nuanced in that story a little bit?
Well, you know, the native populations, first of all, you have to start with this. There's this notion that the conquistadors swept into something that was, you know, there's a little empire here and a little empire there, and largely uninhabited, which is certainly the North American thing, is that nobody was here, and so we took it. In fact, the populations throughout Latin America in the indigenous world were vast, and they were effervescent. And they were in Tenochtitlan alone, there were 20 million people in the Mexico City area. When the conquistadors actually, came into Tenochtitlan, now Mexico City, they were struck by the sophistication of the city. There were canals. There was a certain etiquette to negotiate the canals. There
Developed economy.
the temples, there was a trading, there were markets with trading, and the trading was going up and down the coast and into the Caribbean and down into Latin America. There was such sophistication and such knowledge as well. I mean, the astronomical awareness of the Inca was extraordinary. I mean, it was in many ways beyond the capabilities of any astronomers at the time in Europe. And you had, these huge cities. The Inca's empire was so large that it was the distance from Stockholm in Sweden all the way to Riyadh. It was an empire that was as long this way as the United States is wide. It was huge, and it was quite extraordinary. The sophistication was definitely there. They didn't have the wheel, right? I mean, they had actually the sun. You would have thought, if you worship the sun, maybe you'll get the wheel. But even though they didn't have the wheel, I mean, you go to Machu Picchu and you see how those stones were dragged up the mountains and the enormous capabilities that they had in lieu of the wheel. So, and I don't think that you romanticized in your review the indigenous capabilities. They were also violent. They were not easily conquered. They were, in some cultures, cannibalistic, which was very convenient for the Catholic Church, because then they could say, look at these abominators, and they could use religion then as a tool, really, to actually savage the races, because what happened was an enormous sort of genocide that followed. That 20 million in Tenochtitlan became 1 million in the course of, a quarter century, 25 years. And then, of course, disease ripped through. People don't realize that in the Inca world, the smallpox that the Europeans brought with them, that the Spanish brought with them, traveled down the continent to the Inca Empire long before Pizarro arrived. So that when Pizarro arrived, Huayna Capac, who was the ruler at the time, when Pizarro set out, Huayna Capac was dead of smallpox before Pizarro even set foot with his men. So this was this very extraordinary eradication of a culture that happened so quickly and so violently.
Yeah. As far as, I mean, you can sort of make these comparisons between the conquistadors and the indigenous people on many levels. You do acknowledge that there was human sacrifice and a lot of violence in the native regions. But when you get to some of these other levels, religion, for example, I mean, Christianity does not come off well in your book, whereas you seem to have a lot of respect for the indigenous religion and the sort of the discipline that people had with respect to Mother Earth and so forth. I mean, on the other hand, it's hard to see anything that these conquistadors did that reflected Christian values.
Yes, they used Christian values, and they used them very well. Columbus came to the New World with no priest on board. Which was unusual. I mean, obviously, because if you're Catholic, you know that at some point you have to do confession. You have to abide by the faith's rules. And so he obviously thought he was going to not be gone more than a few months. He traveled without a priest, and of course, Columbus very soon came into a lot of trouble. Why? Because he didn't find enough gold. He was trying to persuade the king and the queen that he had a lot of gold, and then he scrapped around and found some pearls. But he really didn't find as much gold as Isabella and Ferdinand needed. So he started slaving, and he took the Taino people and was shipping them back in by the boatload to Europe as slaves. He had done this before. Columbus was a slaver in North Africa, so this was an easy expedient. But as time wore on, it became very clear that Isabella, especially, was wavering. She was because there were priests like Bartolomé de las Casas who said, "Well, you're being so cruel. This is savage. This is horrible." He described it as a continent choked up with blood, and the decimation of the populations was very troubling to him, and he made a very big point of it to the king and queen. So there was this wavering of, what are we doing down there? And the way that was quickly identified as being the way to mollify the king and the queen was to be evangelists and to say, well, look, we may be doing what we're doing here, but we're sending you, and then eventually sending them a lot of silver and a lot more gold. But we're also evangelizing the people. We're bringing people to the church, and nothing pleased Queen Isabella more than bringing souls to the church. So eventually, Cortés and Pizarro knew enough, the other Balboa, everybody knew enough by then to bring a priest along. And interestingly enough, very often the priests were relatives of the conquistadors. The priest who was Vicente, who was the companion or the priest on board for Pizarro, was actually a distant cousin. All of them were in some way related. So,
one of the most fascinating, and it's kind of a discrete little story in your book, and maybe it's fascinating to me because I'm covering religion now, was your explanation of why evangelicalism and Pentecostalism has proved so popular in Latin America as opposed to Catholicism. And what was interesting about your explanation is the way that you were able to tie the attraction of Pentecostalism back to kind of the indigenous religious tradition.
Yes. Well, the thing about the evangelists and the Pentecostalists is that they actually go and live with the people. And of course, in the Catholic Church didn't go and live with the people. They sided with power. The cardinal or the bishop's house was always next to the governor's house, and there was this element of power to the church. And the sense too that that the church was actually always on the side of Spain, where the colonial days, the church was always minding the viceroy or the captaincy or whatever. It was always going by the rules, and so the church was actually. From the indigenous point of view, there were many faithful and many who were evangelized, obviously in very strong and powerful ways. But I think eventually, in recent times, the whole notion, of course, Latin America went through the liberation theology phase, which was a very difficult time. The 60s and the 70s in Latin America were probably one of the most difficult times in modern history for the region, and it got to the point where certain priests realized that the church was siding too much with the power structure it had in colonial times, and it was doing it in modern times. And they broke with tradition and decided that if they were going to defend the people at the grassroots level, and if they had to carry guns, they would do that. And of course, the reaction was so strong from Rome and from the people that we had so many priests being gunned down in their own churches, and so many priests being just murdered and killed. And so that sense of, I think, the combination of siding with the power and then the liberation theology was kind of a scare factor for a lot of poor indigenous people or people of simple lives, and they quickly understood that the evangelists who were saying, "Look, you can be born again. You can start all over again. You can,
It was more spiritual.
yeah, yeah, and not only that, but we will live with you in your villages, and we will, feed our water, or feed and give water, the same water that you give to your children. We will give to our children, and we will live with you. We will carry your burdens in a most literal way." And I think that was enormously appealing. Of course, also evangelism preaches that that your life will be better financially, and just you will better your lifestyle if you become you will become a better person. And you find in Brazil now 1 in 5 people are evangelists. And it's interesting because and I have seen this happen in Brazil. You have evangelists knocking on people's doors looking for work, and they will say, I'm an evangelist, so that means I will not drink, I will not molest your daughter, and I will show up in the morning when I'm told to do it, because the implication is those Catholics, are all drunks and they're raping your daughter and they're, all this sort of stuff. And the evangelists have really gotten that sort of hold on the imaginations, I think, of the indigenous at this point.
Well, I want to give you all a chance to ask Marie some questions too. But before you go there, I want you said something really interesting, fascinating in one of your interviews. You said that as a child, you always had to explain one parent to the other, your Peruvian father to your American mother, or vice versa. They always seemed baffled by each other's cultures, urgently in need of a translation. It trained me to think about the deep cultural divide between the Americans and the very separate histories that inform them. That's a fascinating idea, the child as a translator between two cultures.
Yes, I always felt I was. My father was always throwing up his hands and saying, "What is she thinking, your mother?" And it was something simple, like, my mother would say, "Go out and run barefoot in the grass." And my father would say, "What? Run barefoot in the grass?" That was the one thing that you did not do in Peru, was run barefoot in the grass, And so then I would have to say, well, and then my mother, on the other hand, would say, "What is he thinking that I can't take you to a funeral? Of course I can take you to a funeral." My father would say, "What? Children are not meant to go to a funeral." And there was this whole thing about the way that you worship, the way that you marry, the way that you bury, the way that you eat. I mean, the way that you educate your children, the way that you talk to your children, the way that the children mind you. All this was very different. And I just remember explaining them to each other because, and I felt, at a certain point in my life, actually, after a whole professional career as an editor, I felt I had to explain to North Americans who Latin Americans were. And that's every book I've written has been a form of explanation.
Yeah, great. Well, as I say, it's a terrific book, and I'm sure that some of you have questions to ask, comments to make. So here's your chance. We have a microphone back here. Yes, sir.
Is it turned on? My name is Kevin Healy, and I ran out and bought your book after I read Tom Gelton's review. What really struck me in the review that made me want to read the book is mentioning the life of Javier Alboz, a dear friend and person I've known for a long time as a Bolivianist. And so I had a question. I was very delighted that you portrayed his career and its importance and so forth, because frankly, a lot of people outside of Bolivia don't know about him except the large academic communities who have read his stuff, and Jesuit networks and so forth. So I guess my question is, were you looking for a character like that as a part of your structure of your book to make a different statement about, some really positive work in Latin America? Because overall, it's a pretty strong critique of the conquest and the Spanish institutions and republicanism and so on. But Javier, it comes out very nicely in your book, and you just mentioned liberation theology, which you mentioned it as though we're a passing kind of phase, and Javier Alboz is very much a liberation theology activist still at 85 years old. But I'm wondering, was that part of the strategy to find a church person like that, or you just came across him and said, well, that would really work too? So I'd like to get your response to that.
Thank you very much for asking that question.
Say who he is briefly.
The search for the modern people who would represent this trajectory from history to the present was kind of interesting for me. The representative of Silver is a miner. She is Leonor Gonzalez, who lives in the highest human habitation in the world, which is in Peru, on the border, just close to the border with Bolivia. And Leonor is a widow with 6 children. Her husband died because of a mining accident, and her son, one of her sons, was traumatized and made sort of crippled by that same mining accident when he was 6 years old, accompanying his father into the mines. And Leonor was suddenly supporting 6 children without a husband. And what she did was, you're living in La Rinconada, which is absolutely lawless, no government, no police, no water, no food. It's a rock under a glacier at 18,000 feet. And what she did was do what all the women do who don't have their husbands anymore, who lost their husbands because they ran away, or they're not really husbands, because in the Andes, you pledge your love and your life to somebody. You don't necessarily have it blessed by the church. And so I'm calling him a husband. He wasn't really a husband, but they had 6 children together. And suddenly she was joining an army of women who scrabble up the sides of this absolutely perilous mountain, rock really, to hammer at the rock spill that is coming out of the mines. Women are not allowed in the mines because it's a very superstitious trade, and they think that women will bring them bad luck. So the women go scrabbling up the mountains with their burlap bags on their knees in their skirts, and they take the rock spill and hammer that, looking for little bitty glints of gold. And by the end of a week, they may have $4 worth, and that has to suffice to feed the 6 children. That was my character for Silver, and she represented everything because she was living basically the way that her ancestors, who had always been living in the mines, and this is the illegal or unknown mines, for 500 years. She was living the same life. And then my representative in modern age for sword, for the sort of brutalization that one goes through in a culture that is violent, or if you're put in the position of violent trade, was a young Cuban who was really a ne'er-do-well. He was 17 or 18 years old, and he was drafted into the military when Castro decided to send troops to Angola to show the world how powerful Cuba was, that they could actually ship warriors off to a foreign war. And this young boy landed in Angola and was, quickly thrown into a savage, absolutely brutal war in which he was himself brutalized. He went back to Cuba. He began to small crimes like stealing horses or butchering horses during a time when meat was it was forbidden and impossible to find. And he ended up in jail. Well, what happened is then 1980, Castro says, throw open the jails and let those people go to the boat lifts to America, which is what Carlos did as a Marielito. He went to Key West and then worked his way into the American culture, ended up as a criminal selling cocaine, being a small sort of drug hood, and ended up in Lorton Prison, which is where I followed him. And I had followed him for 20 years. I had followed Leonor Gonzalez for 7. And then it came to, where am I going to find a priest? Because I knew I needed a priest. And I really, I labored over this. I looked for the right one. I couldn't find exactly the right one to represent what I thought needed to be represented, which is the whole arc of the experience of the church in Latin America. And then a professor friend of mine said, you need to meet Javier Albó. So I actually went to La Paz, to Bolivia, to see if he was the right person. He was immediately the right person. This was a man who came to the Americas from, he was Catalan, he was from near Barcelona, a little town near Barcelona. And he had come at the age of 17 years old, just as a young novitiate with a Jesuit denomination. And he had come thinking he was going to evangelize the indigenous people. Well, he fell in love with the Indian people of Bolivia. And he, to the extent that he actually wanted to take on their culture and their beliefs and sort of weave them into his own. He became a great scholar of Quechua, a great scholar of Aymara. He has written tons and reams on the Quechua people and the Aymara people. And just his trajectory, because he covered, I mean, he was from Spain, number one. Number two, he felt in a way that he had to pay back for the way the church had been. So that was interesting to me. And third, the fact that he had gone through that whole phase of wanting to evangelize somebody, drifting through that period of liberation theology, never really getting involved, but being very much in the spirit of that movement, and then ending up as this great, wise advisor to Evo Morales, you know, and Evo Morales, who started out as an elected president, becoming, you know, semi-tyrannical in his ways, and there was Javier Albó saying, Evo, shape up. You know, you can't do this. You can't run again. You can't do all of these things. And so Javier Albó was a treasure to me. It was an absolute find. Thank you for asking that question.
And he's one of the inspiring characters in a narrative that I think it's fair to say is quite disheartening on the whole.
Yes, yes, yes.
You acknowledge that. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, Cristina.
Okay.
What I love about your book, I haven't finished it. Hi, Christina Borelli. I haven't finished the book, but what I love about the book is that you really kind of nail down and describe the DNA of South America. And I'm an anthropologist. All my life I've been, you know, why are South Americans this way and North Americans the other way? Back to your initial question. And you almost say it, but you don't say it. And I'm just wondering whether you stop short or whether you think it's wrong. But to me, what really came out in the book is that the way North America was started off was real hardship. And these people came and they were dying. I mean, the Pilgrims, you know, Thanksgiving, whatever. Whereas the Spaniards arrived, and pretty much within 20 years, it was boatloads of silver and gold and whatever. Do you think that that initial kind of difference, the hardship versus the bounty, is what has really kind of marked the DNA of North America and South America?
That's a really, really interesting question, Cristina, because of course you had nothing like that in the North American model. You did have the cotton, and you did have the tobacco, and you did have that. You had it, and you had the tremendous slave culture that actually made that possible. But there wasn't that that moment in which the conquistadors were making Spain rich, even though Spain then frittered it away, and you know, it basically went everywhere else but Spain. Spain never advanced in the ways that it should have with that money. It went off to Manila and Beijing and to, you know, everywhere else. But that's a very interesting thought. I think that certainly the silver was an aphrodisiac in a way for the Spanish notion of power. And it was immediately powerful. I mean, it right away, within 20 years, there was this, I mean, it changed the nature of the world, because this is how global capitalism began and global trade began, was precisely through Spain pouring this silver into the rest of the world, and then that trade developing, and then all the things coming back from China, Manila, and India, and coming back west. So the effect of the conquest was much more dramatic than the North American sort of pilgrim achievement right away. So there is that, to be sure.
In the back there.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Maria Vallenilla, I work at the Inter-American Development Bank, specifically on gender issues and mining. So your portrayal of Leonor and the chapter of silver was very entertaining, and the juxtaposition between the current and the history was wonderful. So I have a recommendation and then a thank you. A recommendation is I've been reading your book through Audible. That has made me not butcher the Aztec and Inca ways of how you pronounce the words. So that would be a recommendation for the audience to do that if that's something you wish. And a thank you because I just had a baby. She's a 1 month old. So you've made my nursing time super entertaining with your Audible book. So I appreciate that. And most likely that's my cue that I need to leave, but I wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Over here.
Hi, Mateo Pasoldan. My question is, I'm going to ask you to pull out a crystal ball, and that's an unfair thing to do. But given the rediscovery that's going on in some of the countries of the region of their indigenous roots and culture, and how the indigenous cultures viewed gender relations as well as their interaction with nature and the environment differently than the Western or Spanish concept, given the inroads made by Protestantism, given the ongoing mestizaje, which is still an ongoing process, and also given ongoing Hispanic immigration to the United States and some of the class and racial structures that are emerging in this society, where do you see North and South and North America and Latin America 300 years from now or 500 years from now? I know it's an unfair question, but will it be different, substantially different from what it looks like now, or what's your guess?
Thank you. It has to be different. It must be different. I mean, we have a population in this country that is now nearing a quarter. By 2050, it will be a third, nearing a third of the North American population. There was an executive editor of the New York Times, James Scotty Reston, who once said, I think quite famously, Americans, meaning the United States of Americans, will do anything for Latin America except read about it, which I have taken as a challenge. It's in a way I think North America, the United States of America, really needs to pay attention, and this is a great mission and mandate that I feel strongly. And it gets lost a bit because Latin America is splintered in a way. I don't like to see it as splintered. I sort of like to see it in the way that Simón Bolívar saw it, which was the possibility of that commonality, of that common history that we all share. We may be different. The Argentines don't think they're Mexicans. The Mexicans don't think that they're Venezuelans. The Venezuelans don't think that they're Costa Ricans. But there is something deeply there, which is what I'm trying to say. And I think that if there's that sense in Latin America that can be achieved, that sort of commonality, and to not be the victims of predation, which I think Latin America has been for so many years. It's been colonized by Spain, and then it was colonized by everybody else. It's been colonized by Europe, by North America, by Canada, and you can see it. And now it's being colonized in somewhat by China, which is coming in and taking the treasures away. And I think that two things need to happen. I think that and it very possibly can happen, Latin America needs to sort of understand that it is worthy, that has problems to address. I mean, the corruption challenge is enormous, and I think that the Odebrecht scandal has made us all stand up and say, this can't go on anymore. It just cannot go on anymore. And I think it's reached that level of pitch that I think is promising to me. And North America, the United States of America, has now reached that level of pitch with the population that we have here that we need to pay attention. And it needs to be a sort of exactly what Michael Shifter is doing here. That kind of dialogue that needs to be had is very possible and it will be enormously salutary. Thank you for the question.
You, sir, and I think we'd need to wrap it up probably after that. You can grab Marie afterwards. Also, I think you're going to be signing books, right, Marie?
Sorry? Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Skilton. I have not read your book yet, so these might be issues that you're addressing, and I look forward to reading it because the questions that you're examining is a fascinating one. I got two items I'm hoping you can comment on. The first is, I was really interested by your comment about the churches and the registries of the births, because that almost implies sort of a quasi-caste system, which I think would impact development. So my question there is whether you have seen a difference in that practice in northern South America versus Argentina, Chile, southern South America, and whether there was a difference in the impact in, say, that practice. And then my second question is the founding fathers of sort of the revolution against Spain. In this country, George Washington, an indispensable man, the impact on the future of this country by those men was significant. Could you contrast the differences in those leaders in North and South America and what impact you think they had?
You should read Bolivar.
Thank you. The first question was about the caste system, right, which was very carefully built by Spain. Let's not forget that right away in the colonies, in order to govern, in order to preach, to be a priest, to govern all and to be a banker, all those three things that I mentioned, you had to be born in Spain. I mean, and quarter was not given to anybody who was of Spanish blood if they were born on the land of Latin America, because this was a way of actually keeping strong control. Eventually, what happened, of course, was that Spain was sending people who were inferior, in a way, to the thinking and the understanding and the ability to govern and the ability to preach to the people than were actually present on the ground in Latin America. So you had this caste system that had to do with birth. And then, of course, that you had, down from that, you had the criollo, who was 100% Spanish, but not born in Spain, who had much less power. I mean, those were the people who actually raised the revolutions in the beginning. And then, of course, you had the mestizo population, and you had the indigenous population. That caste system was kept very, very tightly. And in fact, when the Wars of Independence happened and Spain was ejected from Latin America, immediately it was those white criollos who took over, and they just replaced the colonial power. And it was they who, the elite criollo, who then became the powerful. There were geographic reasons, of course, for Argentina being mainly white and Chile being mainly white, because, of course, in those areas, the indigenous were basically wiped out or pushed back. So and that created a whole different kind of Latin American as well. And the places where the importation of slaves had been so dramatic that they were largely black. I mean, in Brazil, in Guyana, in parts of Venezuela, parts of Colombia, which are in fact very Afro culture and Afro people. So this was so carefully managed by Spain, and then became eventually, to my view, very carefully managed by the white elites who took the power thereafter and created a kind of colonialization of their own. What you say about leadership, you know, Bolivar is always described as being the George Washington of South America, which is so wrong, right? Because he was anybody but George Washington. They did have some things in common. They were both military people. Bolivar didn't start as a military person, but he made his fame as a general, and so did General George Washington. They also came from very rich families. Bolivar came from probably one of the richest families in all of Latin America at the time, and so did George Washington. And they both were deprived. They were in that level that were deprived of actually truly governing and truly truly having control of their own land or their own people, and that whole level of colonials in the United States, or rather in the colonial Americas, was frustrated by the same fact that England was sending over people who were not as prepared, not as smart, not as educated, not as worthy to govern as the George Washington of the United States. So there was that commonality, but there it stops. After that, and they both didn't want to be king. So, but after that it stops. There was so little in common, really. The war that Bolivar prosecuted in Latin America was basically your soldiers were former slaves. That never happened in the Revolutionary War in this country, because it was the reason why eventually John Quincy Adams, John Adams, George Washington didn't want to support the rebellions in Latin America, because the rebellions Bolivar was was liberating slaves, bringing them into his army. His army was basically fought by a lot of people who were barefoot with sticks. You know, this was a very different picture than in North America. So the leadership was different. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, Michael promised you a glass of wine, so I want to give you an opportunity to sort of keep him to that promise. So
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. It's great. Huh?
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
And thanks all for coming.